Lesson 3, reading patterns. Okay, in this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about how to read patterns. I have a book here. It was put out by Leisure Arts a long time ago about how to make Afghans. Okay, now let's turn to, here's an example. It's a cute little heart Afghan. When you first look at the pattern, it's going to look like a bunch of symbols, abbreviations, letters. It's going to be really difficult. But once you learn the basics of all patterns, then it won't be so bad. In the back of your book, or you can find online, there's a list of standard abbreviations. Okay, I also have a standard abbreviation list below. And once you're familiar with these standard abbreviations, you can pretty much work any pattern. They also often, in some of the larger books, give a visual diagram of the basic stitches. Now, when you go to your pattern, it's going to start out with a title, a brief description, and then it's going to give some basic information like the finished size and the material list. So it tells what type of yarn they used, how much yarn, also what size crochet hook, and then it says, or size hook needed for gauge. What is gauge? This is the gauge of this pattern. Gauge refers to how tightly or loosely you crochet and how big your stitches are. For this pattern, since it's an Afghan, the gauge is not extremely important because if your size of your product or your finished item varies from their finished item, it's not a big deal. But let's say you're making a hat or a sweater. You want to make sure that your gauge is the same as the gauge of the person that wrote the pattern, okay? If your stitches are larger or smaller, you need to adjust your hook size so that your gauge is correct. So the gauge says in this pattern, 5 of their V stitches is 4 inches. 10 rows is 5.5 inches. Oftentimes gauge is given over a 4-inch by 4-inch sample or a 2-inch by 2-inch sample. So how do you measure it? Okay, I have an example here of a basket weave stitch I did. Okay, so how is it measured? So for this, I would measure over 2 inches because these are pretty tight stitches. If you can see, I have 9 of these double crochet stitches over 2 inches. And how many rows over 2 inches? I have 3. Can you see that? This light is kind of weird on this, but bear with me. You've got 3 rows in 2 inches. So to make sure I have the same gauge, I would want to make a 2-inch by 2-inch sample and measure it. Okay? So after you see your gauge, you see your material list, it goes into a stitch guide. Most patterns assume you know the basic stitches, but the complicated or more advanced stitches, they're going to give you a little guide, okay? Also, stitches like a V stitch can vary from pattern to pattern. There can be different size popcorns. The scallop can be different sizes. So for this pattern, they're going to tell you exactly how to make each of these. And then if you look at the directions, instead of saying all this information, they would just say popcorn or scallop or V stitch, okay? And then you're going to see each part of the item. We're going to work the Afghan body first and then the edging last, okay? So to begin the body, you would chain, CH means chain, 169 loosely. Okay, you don't want to make your starting chains too tight. You usually do them pretty loose, okay? So once we have our chains, we know we're going to work in rows because it says row 1, row 2, row 3. Sometimes there are rounds. If you work around and around, it will be abbreviated R&D. Okay, and then you just kind of follow the directions. If you get stuck on an abbreviation, you can look it up on your abbreviation list. Also remember, parentheses can mean to repeat the directions inside the parentheses. Parentheses can also indicate how many stitches are in the end of the row. Here you've got, it tells you the right side in parentheses. In sewing, if you don't know right side and wrong side, it basically means the right side is like the pretty side or the front side, and the wrong side is the back side. But they say right and wrong instead of kind of front and back or what have you. Okay, there'll be different symbols. A lot of times in between these symbols, it means to repeat the directions between the symbols, whether they're asterisks or stars or that funny little thing there. Okay, so let's look at some other patterns. Most patterns are pretty standard. You'll see some different things. Here's a great book. It just came out. It's got an awesome variety of stitches. Okay, so this book is an example where they show you a diagram. Okay, each of those symbols in the diagram is a crochet stitch. So that's kind of nice if you have a diagram to help you out. Here you see row 1, row 2, row 3. They use brackets to indicate to work all the stitches into one stitch. Here we've got a bracket. Okay, and then if you get confused, like SK, look it up on the abbreviation list. It means skip. To begin, since this is a sample, it says chain a multiple of 8 stitches plus 2. You can make this as large or as small as you want, as long as you start with 8 stitches plus 2. Okay, so that's that. Here is one of my books that I put out recently. And what I like to do in all of my patterns, my PDF patterns, my Kindle patterns, my app patterns coming soon, and I have a couple of print books, is I like to do full color photos, okay? They're really geared for the beginner, okay? And I have kind of step-by-step photos. This is a book of baby blankets. Notice I always start with, I typically say what skill level the pattern is directed for. Skill level, finish size, your material list, your hook size. This one, you notice you need 2 different sizes of hooks, and then the gauge. Over 4 inches, you're going to need to have 10 stitches and 4 rows over 4 inches, okay? And then I do describe, if I have a special stitch here, I describe what it is, and then all the photos. So that's kind of what I like to do in my pattern books. Now, if you go looking for vintage patterns, a lot of times you're going to find vintage patterns free on the internet with expired copyrights, and that's fine, but keep in mind when you download vintage patterns, they can be pretty confusing. Okay, here's one, but they're kind of fun to work through. This one's worked with a cotton thread and actually a steel crochet hook, a really small crochet hook. They do give you a gauge, and then they show how to make the strips of your flowers. This one comes with a little diagram. This one also comes with a diagram. This is an old tray cloth, some vintage doily patterns. So these are always fun. And yeah, it tells you pretty much lists starting at center, chain 13, join with a slip stitch to form a ring. This one's worked in the round. And yeah, it's actually kind of fun to try and figure out the different patterns and try and decode and decipher them. If you ever get stuck, always look at abbreviation lists. And also there's plenty of YouTube videos that show you some of the more complicated stitches. And that's it. Thanks for watching.